Good evening, everyone. I am your host and MC, Vice Consul Stephanie Alexis A. Cruz, for tonight's webinar entitled Briefing on Personal Safety and Domestic Violence, brought to you by the Philippine Consulate General in Calgary in cooperation with our partners from the Calgary Police Service. We are happy that we have 37 participants joining us tonight via the Zoom platform. Before we begin, some housekeeping rules. Next slide, please. Yes, okay. Please remain muted during the duration of the program. Questions are welcome to be raised using the Zoom chat box, and which will be read during the question and answer portion. When writing your question, please identify yourselves and to whom the question should be addressed. Next slide. May we first call on Consul General Zaldi V. Patron of the Philippine Consulate General in Calgary to deliver his welcome remarks. Consul General Patron.
Thank you very much, Vice Consul Stephanie. Good evening to all our participants tonight. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to our online briefing on personal safety and domestic violence, which the Philippine Consulate General in Calgary is conducting in cooperation with the Calgary Police Service. I would like to thank Detective Jeff Anderson and Constable Pierre Poitras, who will serve as our resource person for this activity. This webinar is another project of the Philippine Consulate General under its Gender and Development Program for 2022. Last week, we had a GAD webinar on lung cancer awareness. We are organizing tonight's webinar to support the annual 18-day campaign to end violence against women, which is being observed in the Philippines from 25 November, which is the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women, up to 12 December, which is also observed as the Philippine Anti-Trafficking in Persons Day. In 2006, under Proclamation number 1172, the Philippines extended by 2 days its campaign for the United Nations 16-day activism against gender-based violence. The objective of the 18-day campaign to end violence against women in the Philippines is to raise awareness and ignite action for the protection of human rights of women and girls against all forms of gender-based violence. According to the World Health Organization and the UN Women Organization, 1 in 3 women worldwide have experienced either physical and or sexual violence from their intimate partner or non-partner in their lifetime. In the Philippines, the Philippine Statistics Authority, in its National Demographic Health Survey in 2017, found out that 1 in 4, or about 25% of Filipino women aged 15 to 49 have experienced physical, emotional, or sexual violence from their husbands or partners. In Canada, according to Statistics Canada, 26% of the 400,000 victims of police-reported violent crimes in 2019 were victimized by a family member who can either be a spouse, parent, child, sibling, or an extended family member. Women and girl victims accounted for 67% of family violence. In addition, out of 107,810 people aged 15 or over who have experienced intimate partner violence, 79% of them were women. The Philippine Commission on Women has chosen the theme United for a Vow-Free Philippines for this year's VOW campaign. With this theme, the Philippine Commission on Women joins the UN Women in calling on governments, civil society, women's organization, young people, the private sector, media, and the UN system to join forces to address the global pandemic of violence against women and girls. The Philippine Consulate General in Calgary joins this cause through the conduct of this online briefing as we strive to make Filipinos in Alberta and Saskatchewan, especially the Filipino women, aware of the measures on how to ensure their personal safety. At the same time, we would like everyone to be more vigilant in identifying acts of domestic violence and to be more knowledgeable of the courses of action that the victims of domestic violence can take. I encourage our participants tonight to share with their own family and friends the useful information they will gather this evening as we at the Philippine Consulate in General in Calgary want our Filipino community to be safe at all times. May we have a productive and informative webinar. Maraming salamat po.
Thank you very much, Consul General Patron. And now, to begin our webinar, I am honored to introduce our resource speaker for this evening from the Calgary Police Service. To provide the personal safety training, we have resource speaker Constable Pierre Poitras. Constable Pierre Poitras has 17 years of police experience with the Calgary Police Service. Constable Poitras, you now have the virtual floor.
Hello, I'm going to give this a go. Kamusta and salamat po for having me tonight. I'm very happy to be here. It's weird to do it. It's my first time on a Zoom meeting doing this talk, I guess. Usually my partner and I do it live, and it's a lot of fun. We get lots of participation. So I do have the chat up. So if anybody wants to throw up questions as I speak, please feel free to do so, and I'll try to keep up. Again, myself, Constable Poitras, been a police officer for 17 years with the Calgary Police Service, trained in paramedic, worked in hospital settings as security, so did a lot of things like that, dabbled in martial arts since I was about 16 years old, so lots of background in all of these things. But tonight, it's about you guys, and it's about your safety. And usually the way we start our conversations with the groups are, well, we all made it here, so we're doing pretty good. So everything I'm going to talk about tonight is not going to be reinventing the wheel. I think it's more going to be maybe things you already knew and you thought, oh, maybe I'm being silly if I think that way. But if we can be aware of our environment, I think the safer we can all be. So again, thank you for having me, and I'll do my best. So I think I'd like to start tonight with personal safety tip. Very, very simple things. What we get asked a lot is how to be safe on public transit. Public transit has been a big conversation with many of our locals who aren't too sure how to react when they're approached by someone in need or a drug user or someone a little weird or somebody asking for money. So I think the best way to approach these folks is when they do approach you, it's okay to say hi, and it's okay to say, have a good day. Apologize, I don't have any money on me, and keep on going, right? One of the important things I think anywhere we go in the world is to be friendly and to put on a good face and to look confident as we walk. People see us before they talk to us. So if we're walking around and we have our headphones on and a hood, yes, it's cold outside and that's normal. But especially the headphones, especially if we're walking to work or we're on a cell phone and we're not paying attention, we're creating sort of an environment where we can be victimized. So being aware of our environment by, obviously, the headphones is one of the biggest things. We unfortunately get a few deaths or very bad collisions every year with the C train, and people had their headphones on, weren't paying attention, and it can be life-changing or worse. So that would be kind of my number one tip. Then I figured we could kind of concentrate on the Christmas holidays and during the winter, and maybe we have family gatherings, we have late nights, we have all of these things. And I would say that make yourself aware of each other. Go to an environment that that you feel safe, that you feel confident, and that makes you feel like you're in control. Whereas sometimes you can't help these things, but for you um, to maybe listen to the voice in the back of your head where you think, you know what, I'm getting off work. Like even right now, you get off work at 5:30, 6 o'clock. It can be quite dark. And maybe asking security in your building, would you like to, could you walk me out to my car? Or walking outside of your office or whatever job you have, um, as a group, maybe talk to your coworkers and say, hey, I'm going to work a little overtime tonight. Not sure what you're up to, but I'm planning on leaving at 6:30 or 7, 8, 9, 10 or whatever. And maybe find another person that's going to be with you and being in a group. The other thing is have your cell phone with you. Cell phones are an amazing thing for a society where they can be a pain in the butt for sure if you have teenage kids, but they can also be incredibly useful when it comes to safety and security of others and yourselves. I tell my 16-year-old daughter that if anything happens, if she feels like she's in an environment where she's unsafe, just turn on the camera on your phone. And it may sound silly, may look silly, but that may be something that helps the police tremendously in catching either your offender or somebody that needs help. And that's where one of these things I think we forget about personal safety, where we can actually be there for others by helping ourselves. And what I mean by that is, on the C-Train platform, or you're on a walking path or in the mall or anything, and you feel that this person that approached you was maybe a little too much, maybe not violent, but a little too aggressive in the way he approached you, or just didn't seem right. It's completely fine to call us and contact the non-emergency number. I'll actually put it up as we talk. Non-emergency. And what I would see by doing that is you're helping somebody that actually might need medical help. So sorry, there you go. So non-emergency 403-266-1234. And we actually get a lot of questions, funny enough, from adults. They say, oh, I never call the police. And we say, well, why not? It's because they don't know when. They think somebody has to be shot, somebody has to be dying, it has to be something crazy to call the police. Well, that's not true. The non-emergency number, believe it or not, will be answered by, oh, I apologize, I made a typo there. It's supposed to be 403, not 430. For us, so when you call dispatch, whether you call 911 or you call the non-emergency number, you're going to get the same phone operator. We have a bank of people that answer phone calls all day and all night. And depending on where it needs to go, so either EMS, fire, or police, you'll get some of the same people, and they're all trained in emergencies. And if you're not sure, should I call the non-emergency or 911? Call 911 and they'll direct you. They'll send you to the non-emergency line if it's obviously not an emergency. But what that does for us is that person that you're calling about may actually be experiencing their own medical emergency. They might be going through all sorts of psychological issues that you wouldn't know about, and it happens quite a bit. And that's one of the ways that we can help them. And by doing that, we're actually taking care of each other. And I think that would be my next talking point, is getting to know your neighbors. I think we've been split up a lot in our society in the past, decade or two, where we don't trust our neighbors, we don't want to talk to them. But if you know who your neighbor is, and if you know who their neighbor is, you're right there, you're making your community safer. You know their children, or you know the grandparents, or you just know them, period. And that might make the difference between having a safe and an unsafe neighborhood. Where I can tell you that some of the best neighborhoods I've been in policing, believe it or not, were Forest Lawn and Dover, and some of the communities that people say, oh, those are terrible communities, it's where all the crime happens. Well, yes, there's a lot of crime there, but it's not from the people that live there. It's usually by renters or transients or people that are just it's low income housing. However, the people that have lived there for a very long time, they know each other, they know their neighbor, and it's an amazing thing to watch how community minded they are. And then I think back about the Filipino community. I was lucky enough to have a Filipino nanny for my kids, and we're still friends with her. And joining you guys as community has been absolutely amazing. The food is incredible, first of all, and I absolutely love it. But that's where, if we can come together as a community to keep each other safe globally, we're going to make a big difference that way. So next topic, and I'm trying to talk fast. I've only got kind of 15 minutes, so hopefully, if you have any questions, throw them up. I'd like to talk about grandparent scams, more of a fraud prevention, but also maybe personal safety, because the new scams now, where they say, somebody calls you and you're an elderly person, and you pick up and it's going to be, hey grandma, I'm in jail, I need some money. You might say, hey John, is that you? Yeah, it is. And then you get into this conversation, and unbeknownst to you, it's not John, it's nobody you know. They're just impersonating that family member of yours. And what ends up happening, you're like, I'm not too sure I'm going to send money, this and that. And then they can say, I'm going to send a friend over to your house. What's your address again? And then, believe it or not, people have had, people show up to their house saying, hey, I'm here for the money for John. So if you get, if you get caught in an event like this, call us. We want to know who's showing up at your house. And even if nobody shows up at your house, then great. You know what? We made it safer, and that's our job as police officer. We our first thing is to help you and to protect you. So please don't stop yourself from calling us when you feel that your life is in danger, or that you feel threatened or being taken advantage of. And so that would be kind of a little tip there for the fraud prevention. Obviously, we get lots of email scams during Christmas, gift card buying, and so on and so forth, or saying that the government's going to come after you if you don't send them money. First of all, the government would never do that. They'll just take your money. And so that's what they're going to do. So if you want to throw some questions up, usually in person, it's a lot easier, because we can kind of ask people like, hey, what would you like to talk about? What's something that you're worried about? What's something in your community or in your life that you're not too sure about, that you'd like to hear more about? I can talk about gun violence. I can talk about safety when it comes to protecting yourself from maybe an attacker, where somebody does come onto you, does grab you, and kind of an idea on what to do. So there's things like that. So we can roll into that, where, let's say, unfortunately, it's somebody comes up to you, touches you. First of all, nobody's allowed to touch you without you saying that's okay. We need to recognize that. And your first line of defense would be start yelling out loud. Stop yelling, stop touching me, stop touching me. Stop attacking me, and have your phone with you, and call the police at this point. So does anybody else have questions right now? I'm feeling kind of, where can I go with this?
If it's okay with you, Constable Poitras will have the questions directed to you during the question and answer session.
Sure. Yeah,
You
no
okay?
problem. Okay, yeah, no
Right.
problem. Then let's oh, well, thank you. Yeah, the neighborhood thing is a huge deal. There's lots and lots of opportunity today too, to have different technology on your house that's quite cheap. Even if they're fake cameras, putting cameras on the front and back of your house is going to deter a lot of offenders, a lot of bad guys, as we call them in our world, from coming to your house and causing issues. Another thing is, if you see your neighbor's garage opened at night, just maybe go knock on their door, or if you have their phone number, give them a shout and say, hey, your garage is open. And that'll stop, that'll hopefully stop somebody from coming in and stealing stuff during the night. And what else can I tell you about? I mean, it just, personal safety as in the mall. Actually, let's go with Christmas shopping right now. I think we've all heard it, not to just stash all of our Christmas gifts, at the mall in our car, where it's where it's easily accessible, right? Where somebody can see it in the back seat or in the front seats. So be mindful when you go to the mall and you end up buying way too many gifts. It might be a good idea to just put it in your trunk, take it home, and then go for a second trip, right? And be mindful as you walk out of the mall who's around. Luckily now, I think places like Chinook Mall, I believe Sunridge, Marlboro, they have a lot of police presence, a lot of security just for those issues um, where it makes people that would otherwise try to take gifts from you and so on or take advantage of you. I think we've realized that now, that it's an important time for us to be around and to be out there and take care of the shoppers and so on. All right. Yeah, I guess I think my best bet is waiting for me for some questions for the end. Unless there's something else you want me to talk about. I know Detective Anderson's going to have a bunch of good information for domestic conflict and so on. And then at the end, if I think of anything, I'll bring up some points for you guys. But personal safety is very subjective to someone, to the individual. And yeah.
Thank you very much, Constable Poitras. I'm pretty sure a lot of our participants have questions, which we can have during the question and answer session. So all of the information that you gave was very practical to keep ourselves and our loved ones safe, and I'm pretty sure all of our participants appreciate these tips. The second part of tonight's program is a briefing on domestic violence. Our speaker is Sergeant or Detective Jeff Anderson. Sergeant Anderson graduated from the University of Alberta with a Bachelor of Arts in Criminology and is now a detective with the Calgary Police Service. Detective Anderson has been a member of the Calgary Police Service for 22 years and has been a supervisor for the domestic violence team since October 2021. As a constable, he worked as an investigator in the Calgary Police Service Domestic Conflict Unit. After being promoted to the rank of detective, he worked in several areas, including the Homicide Unit and the Sexual Assault Investigative Unit. Detective Anderson, you now have the virtual floor.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that great opening. I want to start off by just saying I'm very proud and honored to be here today to speak to your community. The awareness of domestic violence is incredibly important to all communities, and I'm glad to be giving some information to yours tonight. And I'm thankful that we were requested to do this. It's a big honor. So if we can just get into the PowerPoint, that'd be excellent. What I'll do is, while the PowerPoint is up, I'll be talking about information around the PowerPoint and allowing you to see the points that are on it as well. I won't just read the PowerPoint to you, but I will kind of expand on some of those points. One of the first things I wanted to mention before I begin is that the area of domestic violence is a very complex one. And tonight I'm going to be talking to you for approximately 30 minutes, maybe a little bit more. It's not a lot of time to cover the area of domestic violence. Today I'm hoping to cover the basics of domestic violence so that you have a good starting point on what is domestic violence, how does the Calgary Police Service respond to it, and then what are some resources your community can use if they find themselves or a loved one in a domestic violence situation. So I will cover all that material. Like I said, normally some of these topics we can spend an entire day on in training. So I'll give you the basics, and I'm sure there'll be lots of questions, and I'll give you some context to where you can find more information after if you're interested. So if we can go to the next slide. So this is just our agenda for this evening for my talk. I just want to start by introducing how the domestic conflict unit within the Calgary Police Service works. And then I'll go into what domestic violence is and the types of abuse that are used. And some information on how you understand the abuser. who they are, what they do, types of abuse that they use, and then understanding a bit about victims of domestic violence, because often we get confused by how people stay in these relationships and how they become victims. And it's important to understand the basics of how people get involved in an abusive relationship, and then how we can help them and understand and show some empathy to get them out of those relationships. Then we're going to talk about a little bit about what happens when police get involved. And then we're going to move into some resources that are available in the community in Calgary for people who are involved in domestic violence or abuse to get some help with that. And then, of course, at the end, there'll be some questions. If you can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So I noticed a little typo there when I was going over this. My apologies for that. But just so you understand a bit of how the domestic conflict unit within the Calgary Police Service works. Domestic conflict unit within the Calgary Police Service is the overarching umbrella unit for the Calgary Police Service. And within the domestic conflict unit, there are 4 different sub-teams. The first team is our risk assessment team, which is made up of 5 civilians. And what they do is they review every call for service of a domestic nature that happens in the city of Calgary every day. Now, anytime a police officer, a uniformed patrol member, attends a call for service for domestic violence, they are required by our policy to submit a police report. And our risk assessors then review those reports and determine from the information that's in the report whether this situation is a high-risk one. By being high risk, meaning for future violence or severe abuse. If our civilian risk assessors feel that it meets that criteria of being high risk, they will then assign it to one of the 3 investigative teams. And those teams are the domestic conflict response team, the elder abuse team, and the domestic violence team. I'll give you a very brief kind of definition of what each of those 3 teams do, so you have a little bit of an understanding. The domestic conflict response team is one that deals with domestic or family violence or family situations that may not meet the criteria of being criminal. And we're trying to front load the family with resources and information so they can avoid being involved in the courts and involved with criminal offenses. So they're trying to divert the family away from that and help the family deal with the situation without out the criminal courts being involved. And to do that, the members in the domestic response team, they are uniformed members who work hand in hand, side by side with a social worker. And they provide resources to families to help divert them away from the criminal courts. The elder abuse team, this is a team that deals with family violence where the victims of that abuse or violence are elderly people. So whenever a police officer is dealing with a situation where there's a victim who is over the age of 60, the elder abuse team may get involved to support that victim, to help them to get out of that situation or deal with that situation they're in. Now, the team that I supervise is the domestic violence team, and we're a team of investigators that deal with strictly criminal matters. So when something's escalated to the point where the abuse is deemed to be criminal, my team, if it's high risk for violence, my team will be involved and investigate each of those. Okay, so each team has its own separate mandate, and we deal with things in a different way. And we will share and we will assist each other from time to time. So if we can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So domestic violence is a broad term, and often it's known by all kinds of different, you can just scroll through and show them all, that'd be great. Thank you very much. Often it's known by a bunch of different names. So when I'm talking today about domestic violence, what I'm talking about is all of these that you see on the screen, just different terms people use to describe basically the same thing. Sometimes it's known as intimate partner violence. Sometimes it's family violence or spousal abuse. When I'm referring to domestic violence, I'm referring to all of those. So if you know, if in your, how you've come to think about domestic violence, if you think about it in one of these other terms, I'm referring to that when I'm speaking tonight. Okay, so we can go to the next slide. The Calgary Police Service has probably one of the broadest definition of what a domestic relationship is of any police agency in Canada. So when a police officer, a uniformed member, goes to a residence, goes to a home for a call of domestic violence, they will be putting in a police report on anything that involves any relationship that you see on the screen. So it's a very broad one. So you'll have boyfriend, girlfriend, husband, wife. You might have people who are related through extended family, a caregiver who is a full-time caregiver in the home, maybe to an elderly person, that will be considered a domestic relationship. You'll have even ex-spouses and ex-partners. They're still considered to be a domestic relationship by the Calgary Police Service. So anytime a police officer attends a call for service involving any of these types of relationships, they will be putting in a police report and dealing with it through our policies and procedures. We can go to the next slide. So how do we define what domestic violence is? What does it look like? So domestic violence is a broad term that defines any violence or abuse that happens between an intimate relationship or a relationship where there's a dependency or a trusting relationship between people. So it depends on the context and the place, but it's a very broad definition that can include family violence or intimate partner violence. And obviously intimate partner violence, it's fairly self-explanatory who we're talking about. We're talking about current or past spouses or partners. And it can involve things such as physical violence, sexual violence, or psychological and emotional violence. Now, family violence captures more of those types of relationships. This is where you'll have a power and control type of issue in a family where one person exerting power and control over others and within the family, and their security and well-being is being threatened. Next slide, please. So some myths. Often when we're dealing with domestic violence, we hear a lot of myths out there that people hold on to. These are things that people maybe grew up hearing or have heard through just word of mouth. But I just wanted to point out some of the myths that are out there. First one is that domestic violence is rare. Unfortunately, it's not a rare topic. It happens across all walks of life, people from all different religions, all different ethnicities, all different kind of communities. Domestic violence is unfortunately not a rare topic. We'll talk a little bit more later on some of the stats, the statistics that are happening in Calgary, but it is not a rare thing. Now, one of the other myths that we often hear is that domestic violence is something that can be handled within the family or the community, that police don't need to get involved, that other agencies in the community don't need to get involved, that the family can deal with this on their own, or that the community group can deal with it on their own. And what we've seen through history, through human history, is that when things are kept between the family or between small community groups, often things don't change and the violence doesn't stop. So this is where we need to deal with it as a collective, as it's a societal issue, not just one that's a family issue. Another myth is that people in lower income households are more at risk for domestic violence than people that come from more affluent backgrounds. And this is a big myth that has been around for quite some time. There actually is no distinction when you look at the statistics on family violence or domestic violence. There's no real distinction between it happens more with people who are in lower incomes and less with people who are more affluent. What you're going to find is it's pretty pretty much the same across the board. What we do see sometimes is that people in lower income households are more at risk for certain types of abuse, but it happens in every type of household. We also have a myth that it's easy to identify people who are victims of domestic violence or abuse. It is often not very easy to spot at all. Sometimes family members don't even know that one of their relatives is being victimized. Victims of domestic violence often go to a lot of lengths to hide it because they're embarrassed or ashamed. And so it's not always easy to spot. And we'll talk about that in a little more detail later. Another myth is that leaving domestic violence is not difficult, that it's easy to do, that you can escape domestic violence very simply. And that's just not true. And we'll talk more about that as well. And then one of the biggest myths that we have out there is that once people leave an abusive relationship, they don't go back. Once they leave, they stay away and they don't go back to it. And that isn't true at all. What we find is that victims of domestic violence will leave a relationship upwards of 15 times before they'll leave for good. So this is important to understand if you are dealing with a family member who's in a relationship that has abuse. Once, if they leave that relationship, what you have to understand is they will often go back to that. And we need to be empathetic and understand the reasons why. And we're going to talk about some of those reasons later. But just because they leave doesn't mean they've left it for good. The next slide. So I'm just you see the list here, types of abuse. It pretty much covers just about every aspect of a person's life. There's physical abuse, verbal, emotional, psychological, financial abuse, the use neglect, isolation, there's sexual abuse, spiritual abuse, and then what we call stalking or harassing behavior. Next slide. We're going to go into and talk just briefly about what each one of those encompasses. Obviously, physical abuse is pretty easy to define. It includes things like choking, punching, pushing, scratching, pulling hair, or even threats of violence or threats to use a weapon. Now, verbal abuse, this includes yelling at the person, using profane language, name calling, put downs, anything verbal that way. Emotional psychological abuse, this will also include things like physical abuse or verbal abuse, but it is often when you talk to victims of abuse, they will tell you that the emotional and psychological abuse was much more traumatic and much more difficult to get over than the physical or verbal abuse. It's very difficult when someone has emotionally or psychologically abused a person, especially over a long period of time, for them to get over that. They do things like, especially for people who are new to Canada, the abuser may threaten to have that victim deported, and that's a real fear for a lot of people. They may threaten to hurt their children or the kids. They may threaten suicide themselves and say, if you leave me, I'm going to kill myself, which often traps people in relationships because they feel responsible for that person. They will put down family and friends. They'll deny physical affection, make the person feel like they have to earn or do something to be rewarded with affection. And it's very emotionally traumatizing. Next slide, please. Financial abuse is a very difficult one for people to deal with. You'll often find people, even affluent people who have jobs and careers, when they're victims of abuse, you'll find that the abuser will control the finances in the home, maybe make the victim hand over their paycheck, and they aren't given any control over any financial funds. They may spend the money without the victim's permission or consent. They may not be allowed to have their own bank account, or they may destroy people's property or possessions or sell their possessions off. These are all things that really control a person and make it difficult for them to leave and make it difficult for them to get by in life. You can think about how hard it is to get through everyday life without any access to funds. It's pretty difficult to maneuver society without any access to any funds. Neglect is another big one. Now, it's not always neglect of the victim. Sometimes it's the victim may have children or a dependent that's living in the home. So maybe the victim of the abuse has an elderly parent that lives in the home. And so the abuser will maybe neglect the elderly person who needs care, or neglect the children as a way to control the victim. That they may say, well, if you're not going to do what I ask or do what I say or act how I want you to act, I'm not going to take care of the kids, or I'm not going to take care of your parent, your mother, your father, or whomever. And so this, especially if people have disabilities, this can be very traumatic. Next slide. A big thing that you'll find that abusers will do, and they often do this right away in a domestic abuse type of relationship, and it's kind of a red flag if you know someone that this is happening with, it's probably a red flag that maybe they're in an abusive relationship, is that abusers will often control and isolate and confine people. So isolation is a big one, where they will often move them out of the city that they have family or friends in. Sometimes they'll leave provinces, they'll even move out of the country and go to different countries to live in, so that they can isolate the person from any supports that they have. Again, for a person who's being abused, not having someone to turn to, not having supports in place for them to go to if they need help or assistance, is a big barrier to leaving. So abusers know this, and they will use that to their advantage by isolating from other people who may influence them to leave or influence them to get help. They want to isolate them from those. So they'll they won't let them see friends. They won't let them go to work functions. Sometimes they won't even let them have a job because they don't want them exposed to other people who may influence them. Next slide, please. Another very difficult type of abuse that people will sometimes endure is sexual abuse, where they'll be made to engage in sex when they don't want to. They may be told that they don't have a choice, that it's not up to them. Their abuser may refuse to use any kind of birth control whatsoever, and then puts the person in a difficult position of maybe becoming pregnant. Often abusers will use that as a way to control people, as pregnancies. It's you can probably imagine how traumatic that would be, how difficult that would be on a person to feel that they don't have control of their own body, that they don't have the right to consent or not consent to sexual behavior. It's probably one of the most difficult things for a person to deal with, and it's one that causes a lot of trauma. Next slide, please. We also will see abusers will use spiritual abuse, where they will maybe stop the first person from going to participating in their spiritual practices. They won't let them go to church. They may put down the other person's beliefs and make them feel like their religion or their spiritual beliefs are wrong, and call into question things that they believed and things that they were brought up to believe in, and which also causes a person to doubt themselves and doubt what they believe. You will see this a lot. The next one, stalking and the harassing behavior, happens a lot in abusive relationships. You'll find that abusers will follow people around. They will use texting and emails and phone calls to check up on other members of the family. They will show up uninvited at places. They will check in on people at work, just to constantly be in control and letting the victim of the abuse know that they're always around and watching, which is again very psychologically troubling to people when they don't feel they have any autonomy or an ability to to be by themselves or be out with family or friends without being checked up on. It's very troubling. Next slide, please. So let's try to understand what the abusers are about and what they're doing. Domestic violence, domestic abuse is a power and control type of crime. It is all about controlling another person, and through that control, the abuser feels powerful. And so what they do is they use the emotional abuse, all these other types of abuse, to feel that control and power over another person, and then to feel good about themselves. It's very embarrassing and causes a lot of stigma to victims, and they will use all kinds of things, threats of violence, threats of suicide, and they will do their best to control every aspect of the victim's life. Next slide. Now, understanding the victim. One of the things we really have to come to terms with and empathize and show some empathy to victims is understanding what they're going through and just how difficult it is to live in a relationship where you are being abused on all different types of fronts. One of the things I wanted to mention is when we were talking about the different types of abuse, is that abusers don't just use one form of abuse. They will use multiple different types of abuse, and sometimes all of them, to control and control their victims. So when you have all these different types of abuse going on, or many different types of abuse, what it does is it causes victims to be in a state of constant fear and constant anxiety, where they don't feel safe. They don't feel safe in their own home. Now, some of you may know people in these types of situations. Often people that attend these groups or have been involved in this themselves. And so what we need to understand is that when a person is a victim of domestic violence or domestic abuse, it's a very complex relationship they have. And it's not an easy one to understand, and that they face challenges on multiple different facets of their life. It's not just physical violence. It's not just verbal abuse. It is they are being bombarded on a daily basis in all different types of ways. And what it does is it causes a person to lose, they don't feel safe, and they lose their confidence. They lose their self-esteem, and often they will be suffering from anxiety or depression, and making everyday decisions and choices becomes very difficult because they're in this constant state of flux and turmoil. They often will have children will be involved in the situation, and they have fears around their children. You have the next slide, please. So we hear this quite often. I've said it myself when I was a uniform patrol member with very early on, many years ago, going to calls for domestic abuse and meeting with victims of abuse. It's a very common thing for victims to hear is you need to leave, just leave. What I can tell you is that almost every victim of domestic violence knows this. They already know that they need to leave, that they should be not in this relationship, that it's not healthy, and that it's wrong. However, it's not that easy. When you think about what they have to consider and what they're dealing with and the challenges that they're dealing with, they are dealing with the constant threat of maybe losing their children. Maybe the abusers told them, if you leave, I'm going to take the children from you, or maybe I'm going to harm the children or harm you. If you leave, maybe I'm going to harm other persons in your family. They may be financially being abused, so they don't have the means to leave, and to be on their own and to support their children. They are suffering from emotional abuse, so they don't feel confident. They feel often will blame themselves and feel that it's their fault, And they're told this on a continual basis by the abuser that it is their fault. And so there's a lot that they have to come to terms with and deal with before they can actually make the decision to leave. And this is why it's important for us as a community to have these supports in place that we're going to talk about later, and resources so that they can support them in leaving that relationship if that's what they want to do. Now, we also support families if they want to stay together, and giving people access to counseling and resources to help them stop the cycle of violence and stop the abuse that's happening in the home. There's even programs for abusers and counseling available if they're willing to partake. So yeah, when we're dealing with this, it's a very complex issue. Telling someone to leave isn't always the solution. They know that. And then sometimes they don't want to leave because they actually care about their abuser. They're in a relationship with them. The relationship wasn't always bad. Sometimes it starts off very loving and kind and everything is good, and things for one reason or another have changed, and they still care about that person and they still love them and they still see the good in them. So sometimes they don't want to leave, but they want the abuse to stop. And so we try to support families, and there's lots of organizations in Calgary that help to support families in leaving, or sorry, staying and helping to stem that abuse. If we can have the next slide. So the barriers, I've already touched on a lot of these. Is sometimes victims don't understand the court system, and going through a divorce may not be something they understand how to go through, or how to go through the legal steps to divide up property like a home or vehicles or what have you. And so there can be a lot of fear based around that, leaving, and all the complexities of that, and the thought that they might have to get a lawyer and how they're going to pay a lawyer to deal with all these things. Again, we have supports in place for a lot of those things. Victims of domestic abuse know that if they leave, they are in danger often, because the abuser has told them over and over again, if you leave this relationship, I will hurt you or I will hurt the children. And this is very difficult for people to get over and to deal with, because they know the abuser very well, and that they know that they're capable of doing these things. And so it often stops them from leaving, is that fear. There may be religious or cultural aspects involved that stop people from leaving. People may believe that divorce is not an option. There may be community reasons why people stay, that splitting up a family isn't an option. And so these are all, they may feel that they're going to be judged by their community or the people in their culture. And so sometimes they stay in these relationships because they don't feel they have the support from the community. And that's why it's really an honor to be here today, talking to your community, seeing the programs that are out there, and what the Filipino community is doing to support family violence and violence against women. It's an excellent show of support in the community. And then one of the things they also might find is there's a lack of trust with the criminal justice system. They may not trust the police. Sometimes people come from parts of the world where the police aren't to be trusted, and it's difficult for them to call the police for help or to trust that help when it comes. And this is completely understandable, why some people find it difficult to reach out for that help. Next slide, please. Can we go to the next slide? So what happens when police get involved? Just going to show you some very quick statistics on domestic violence in Calgary. What we see as a positive trend is, over the last 5 years, domestic calls for service have been on the rise in Calgary. However, the violence has been down. So the level of violence and the number of violent calls that we're going to that are domestic related has gone down over the period of the last 5 years. So people are calling the police more, and when we're showing up, or what they're calling about, has been less violent. So this, to us, is a great sign that a lot of the education that is happening around domestic violence is working because people are reporting it more. Historically, and it's still to this day, that domestic violence is very underreported. It's still a common belief that domestic violence is something that stays in the home and people don't talk about. However, what we're seeing is that people in Calgary are reaching out more and more to the police to report domestic abuse, which is excellent, and which Constable Poitras mentioned earlier is that we appreciate and we want people to call us. We're here to serve the community, and but it's also another positive sign that we're seeing the level of violence is going down. So on average, the Calgary Police Service responds to between 19 and 20,000 calls for service that are domestic related each and every year. The last 2 years, we were just under 20,000 calls for service. That's about 54 calls for service per day in the city of Calgary that police officers will attend that are related to domestic violence. It is by far our most, the call we attend the most of any type of call. So it isn't rare. So what is our policy? How do we deal with domestic violence? What are our guidelines when we get a call? What should people expect from the Calgary Police Service when a patrol member in uniform shows up at their home? So we are influenced, and a lot of our policies are dictated by the Solicitor General of Alberta. They give us the police, the authorities, and they give us our rules to work under. And we're bound by a lot of those. Oh, not a lot of them. We're bound by all of them. And where our other policies are influenced by them. So Calgary Police Service, we have a responsibility to respond to and investigate all incidents of domestic violence, with the goal being safety. Often people feel that the police are there to put people in jail and to arrest people and to charge people, and that's why we're there. But the reality is that we are there to ensure people are safe and safe in their own homes. If that means that we do have to arrest someone, then that's what we have to do. But our goal is safety, and if we can achieve that safety by not arresting and using other resources, then that's what we prefer to do. We like to keep families together, not break families apart if we don't, if it's not called for. So what we stress when we're attending a call is that we will enforce the laws, and we will protect victims and complainants, so that we communicate to the community at large and to the abuser that violent behavior in the home is not to be tolerated and that it's criminal. There has been a long-standing myth that family violence is not criminal, and that what happens behind closed doors stays behind closed doors, and it's just for the family to deal with. And we're trying to break that cycle that people believe that family violence is not a criminal thing and that the society at large shouldn't be involved. Okay. We'll get the next slide. So what can police do? What will happen if you call the police? What can you do as a community member? Well, there's many different things that can happen. You can call the police and just get advice. So you can call that non-emergency number, the 266-1234, and you can ask for advice on family violence or for resources. The City of Calgary also has a wonderful system in place where you can call Calgary 211, and they also will have all kinds of information and resources available to people to get advice or to just be given direction to resources that are available to them in the City of Calgary. So calling the police doesn't mean always that someone's going to come to your home. You can just call in sometimes to get advice on where to go or what to do. Now, if a police officer responds to a home because of a call for domestic abuse or domestic violence, they're going to try to determine from from investigating what happened. Is this criminal or is it not criminal? If it's not criminal in nature, and then they're not going to charge anybody, meaning they're not going to arrest anyone, then what happens is the police officer will put in a police report, like I mentioned earlier, and so that incident is documented. Now, the police officers that attend, they're all given training and access to resources. So they will have the ability to provide advice and to provide phone numbers for resources to families that may need assistance with what's going on in the home. They all carry cards, we call them Connect cards, and that they have a whole stream of phone numbers and different resources available that they can provide people when they attend. A police officer may suggest and ask if family members would like what's called an emergency protection order, which is an order where people in the home can be protected against the abuser. Okay. Now, if a police officer determines that a criminal offense has occurred and that criminal charges are to be laid, they will do that. And one thing that we need to understand, because Canadians, people in Calgary, they often watch a lot of TV, and our TV is influenced by American TV and American police shows. And in the States, United States, the way their laws are is that it's up to the citizen, the victim, whether a charge is laid. But here in Canada, the police officer, the discretion to lay a charge or not is solely that. The decision is solely that of the police officer. And the reason for that is because the police officer is considered to be an objective third person, and a victim who is suffering from all kinds of emotional and psychological trauma can't always determine what the best course of action is, and that's why we leave it in the hands of the police officer. Next slide, please. So some of the laws that we're bound by, obviously the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, the criminal code. So the criminal code is what police officers will refer to determine if an offense has occurred. Now, there's no such thing in the Canadian Criminal Code as domestic assault. It is just simply assault. We call it domestic assault because it happened in a domestic relationship, but in the court's eyes and in the criminal code, it's considered an assault. In Alberta, we have an act called the Protection Against Family Violence Act, which is an incredible act that was passed a number of years ago and gives the police and citizens all kinds of powers and authorities and resources to deal with family violence. Next slide. Yeah. Some of the resources we have, there isn't enough room on these slides I could probably put up 20 slides with all the different resources that are available in the city of Calgary to people who are suffering from family violence or domestic violence. A few of them I've put up here that you may have heard of or that may be more relevant. So there's the Connect, which deals with family and sexual abuse, and their phone number is there as well. They have an online service as well called connectline.ca. We have a 24-hour family violence information line that's available to anybody in the city of Calgary. There's also what's called emergency shelters. So these are places where, generally speaking, women can go to. It's a safe place for them to live by themselves or with their children, to escape the abuse, to get the supports in place for them to be on their own if they need to leave a violent relationship. One of those places is called Fear Is Not Love. They used to be called the Calgary Women's Emergency Shelter. They recently changed their name to Fear Is Not Love, simply for the fact that they're more than just a shelter. They provide a lot of counseling programs to families, to men, to women. They provide a lot of other resources, so they didn't want to be known as just a shelter. Sheriff King is another shelter that's in Calgary, and we have several more in the city of Calgary and in the province that people can utilize. One of a really incredible group that we deal with quite a lot is the Calgary Immigrant Women's Association. This association, they have people who speak just about every dialect you can think of from almost every language. They are an incredible resource to women who are needing assistance, who are new to Canada, and they will provide all kinds of resources and aid to people. I can't speak more highly of them. Of course, there's the Calgary Police Service itself. You can call the non-emergency line or 911 if you need assistance from us. And then we have a distress center that is available 24 hours a day that can be called if people need help. Next slide, and that's it. So I know that was fast. I probably talked quickly, and I put out a lot of information for you. But like I said before, it's a huge topic, one that's not covered very easily in a quick forum. But hopefully that was a benefit to you, and you got some valuable information out of it.
Thank you very much, Detective Anderson, for that very enlightening and informative presentation. Now that we've heard from our speakers, we would like to hear from you, our participants. Again, you may post your questions in the chat box so that I can read them and ask our resource speakers to answer. So right now, we already have 2 questions in the chat box. Let's start first with the question from Consul General Zaldi Patron. It's for Constable Poitres. How serious is gang violence in Calgary nowadays? How do we prevent our community members from getting into it?
Sorry, I'm just going to go back up to the question. It's gang violence, right? Did I hear right?
Yes. How serious is gang violence in Calgary nowadays?
I think Jeff and I can honestly say that if you're not buying drugs, if you're not in the drug trade, if you're not hanging around at night in the back alleys looking to get in trouble, you're never going to run into gang members. They try to keep to themselves a lot of the times. I think what we see on the media, like the Sergeant said, is a lot of news media from the United States. Toronto obviously has its own issues right now, but you have to remember that their amount of population is different than ours. Their demographics are ours. I think Calgary is one of the safest cities to live in the world. But I always try to remind people, anywhere you go, 11 o'clock at night, whether you're on Bourbon Street in New Orleans or you're on Stevens Avenue, downtown Calgary, you're not going to run into the, nicest, smartest, greatest people around. And as for gang violence, just kind of know their hangouts. So it's going to be clubs. It's going to be places where fast money can be made, or so on and so forth. It's everything that your instincts are telling you not to do is where you're going to run into gang violence. Sarge Anderson, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would completely agree with that. One thing I think for people who have children, or grandparents are often concerned about, how do I keep my kids or my grandchildren from getting involved in gangs? And I think talking about it is the biggest thing you can do, and staying vigilant and basically being present in young people's lives is the biggest thing you can do to help prevent them from getting involved in gangs. Often children who get involved in gangs is because they feel isolated, they feel alone, they're looking for connection with other people, and they're looking for connection to feel that sense of community. So I think if they're getting that community from their family or friends or their wider community group, they're less likely to get involved in gangs that way.
Thank you for those answers. Now we have a question from Ms. Cherise Lowe. As a public transit user, I always feel unsafe whenever there are drug users in and around the bus shelters, especially in the northeast and downtown area. Are there measures being done by the police to resolve this issue?
Yeah, so I think that's one of the geopolitical answers that we have to tell everybody. It's been pretty tough with our mayor and the people in council right now. I think your best bet would be to talk to one of your councilors. We've been kind of told as police to leave the homeless population there. It's a super tough question. What I can tell you on my end is, again, anytime during the day, just have a heads up. There are lots and lots of bylaw officers, transit officers, and obviously us. So if you feel unsafe, call us, because again, the more we can get the citizens involved in public safety, the better it is. And that expression of, the squeaky wheel gets the grease. That's where we're going to get. So unfortunately, right now, I think our mandate would be obviously to keep it clean, keep it away from drug users and so on. But it's a tough area to deal with right now. And I think we see it all over Canada, especially in Vancouver, with tent cities and so on. And we're seeing those pop up in Calgary. So I can assure you that the patrol guys and girls that are out there day in and day out, and the social services are doing their best. And it's, I think, coming up with a new old way to deal with things. I think putting more money towards mental health and recovery centers and so on probably go a long way. But again, I think that's up to what we joke around. It's up to the adults in government to deal with it. So I'll pass it on to my colleague as well and see what he has to add to that.
Yeah, I wouldn't disagree with that. It's been a long time for me since I've been involved in that type of work, but I wouldn't disagree. I know that often the police are seen as the bad guys sometimes when we're moving people away. People maybe look a little disadvantaged, or homeless population, we're moving them away from transit centers and stuff, and it's politically a hot topic right now. So I think I agree with you 100%. We need to get the politicians and people talking about what the solutions are.
Thank you. Now to Constable Poitras again. This is from Miss Tess de Jesus. A friend was approached at a bus station by a stranger who asked for her cell phone and then started groping and kissing her. After 5 minutes, he asked for her wallet. There were people at the bus stop, but no one noticed what she was going through. When the guy left, she just cried. The people at the bus stop thought that the guy was a boyfriend, thus adding salt to a psychological injury. What could have been said or done here to stop the sexual assault? Is there any secret code that we can send to bystanders?
You know what? No, don't have a secret code. I've got a 23-year-old son and a 17-year-old daughter, and what I taught them since they were very young is, somebody touches you, start yelling. And I know this may sound totally weird to all of you guys, but how uncomfortable is somebody starts yelling, "Stop touching my vagina," and you yell that out loud, and they're going to look, and that guy's going to run away. I promise. And will it escalate? Probably not. If it does, like I said, have your camera ready. Move closer to people. Make yourself known that you're not comfortable with this. Say to them out loud, "I'm not comfortable with this. Leave me alone. Don't touch me. I don't know you. No, I'm not giving you my phone." And call 911. And whether you're on the phone or not, you can yell that you're at a certain plaza, or yell to somebody, "Call the police," and we'll come help. Also, you've got all the help buttons. Everybody's afraid to pull the fire alarm. This is a reason to pull the fire alarm. Pull it. Hit the stop button on the train and take care of your safety. Your safety is number one. And like I said before, maybe that individual is completely losing his mind. He's either on too many drugs or not enough. And coming to your help will obviously stop the threat and stop whatever's going on. But it also might provide help for this individual. And I'm sure we'll either know him, or in the future, he'll become known to us. And again, it's a positive. And I'm really sorry that had to happen to you. But again, write about it, send it to your counselor, and let them know that if public safety isn't safe, then we need to look that up.
Thank you. To Sergeant Anderson, for young couples, when can constant verbal abuse be reported to the police if there's no palpable or physical evidence?
I think he dropped from the call.
Sergeant Anderson?
No, yeah, I think he dropped from the call, it looks like. I can answer that quickly for you until he comes back. So obviously, yeah, I was on patrol for about 12 years. So I've been to way too many domestics. There's no reason to put up with verbal abuse or any sort of abuse. If you're finding that, you can report it to us or report it to a friend, have somebody else report it. Especially with domestics, we usually don't take third-party complaints, but with a domestic, we'll show up and we'll talk to you guys. Or call social workers, call a counselor. There's many ways to deal with that. But again, you can walk into a police station and ask for advice, or depending on what the person's saying to you, it may be considered more than just verbal abuse. It might be threats. It might be, so there's many things like that. So I hope that answered your question. If it didn't, obviously you can get my email and reach out. And that's for anybody on this chat. If anybody wants to reach out to us, we're always available and more than happy to help you. And it's great to put a face to all our citizens, because we as officers kind of become faceless.
Thanks a lot for answering that question. I got a text from Detective Anderson saying that he will be reconnecting, so let's just wait for a bit.
I'm just
in
going to
the-
take a wild guess that he went out for a coffee and donuts, because that's what detectives do. Oh, I got
we
a
can ask
bunch.
him when he's back.
Yeah, I got a lot of laughs out there.
We can ask him when he gets back, when he reconnects. Yeah. Would you, well, with these questions, would you advise our participants and maybe their friends that they should maybe enroll in a self-defense class? Would you think that would be good?
So yeah, this is what I tell people. Like I tell my daughter this, as especially females are always, and I know I'm going to get hit for this one. My wife is looking at me. But females are always going to be not as strong as men when it comes to physical abuse. And that's something you have to be aware of. But what I told my daughter is, whether a shark attacks you, a bear attacks you, or a lion attacks you, if you poke their eyes, they're going to run away. So since she was very little, it was always, look, if somebody's grabbing you and you can't run away, my number one advice to defending yourself, to getting yourself out of danger, is to run away and to start yelling. No matter how many years I've been training, no matter how many fights I've been in, no matter how many arrests I've done in my civilian life, in my daily life, I'm not going to fight you. I'm just going to run away. And if I can, I'm going to do exactly like I said. I'm going to poke your eye out. And I know it sounds ridiculous, but that's probably one of the best options. Now, I also recommend for people to train, lift weights, do martial arts, do jujitsu, do things that are going to build your confidence. Because by doing that is you're going to have that air of confidence as you're walking around in public. And people will notice that, where you know who the mouse is in the office. You know the person that's not confident, but you also know who's confident in the office. You know who's walking around who you're like, I don't think I'm going to mess with that guy, or I don't think I'm going to mess with that girl, because they're dressed well, their dress and deportment is good, and they have their quote unquote poop together, and they know what they're doing. So that's probably the best thing I can do. The other thing I'll bring up, since we talked about gun violence and gangs and everything, if I can get everybody on this call, that would be incredible. If I can get 10 people on this call to go and get their firearms license. I don't want you to get a gun. I want you to get a firearms license to educate yourself in what firearms are all about, and what firearm rules and laws are in Canada, and how difficult it is to get a firearm in Canada. Now, I'm not talking a criminally obtained firearm. I'm talking about firearms that you buy in the store, that you buy at Cabela's. And just to give you guys an example, as a police officer, it took me a year and a half to get my gun license. So I took my courses, I applied for my test. I needed over 12 different references, and they all got called by the RCMP. And it took a year and a half for me to just get my license. And then after that, there's tons of rules and regulations on firearms in Canada. So it's very, very important that I think as Canadians, we're educated, and things like that don't cost a lot of money, but they'll go a long, long way in making you realize that, you know what, it's not the gun that's the problem, it's the people. It's kind of like saying drunk drivers, it's the alcohol that's the problem. No, it's the people, right? I see this other question for Sergeant Anderson. Are you okay if I answer it again?
Sergeant Anderson is actually back on the call.
Oh, is he? Okay, perfect.
Yes.
Sorry about that.
No worries.
So I picked on you a little while you were gone. I apologize. I told them you were out for coffee and donuts.
Well, probably you're not probably too far off.
Yes. So For Sergeant Anderson, we have a question from Miss Paul. How to help someone who is suicidal due to domestic abuse?
It's an excellent question, and one that will trouble anyone who has a loved one who's suffering in this manner. What I would tell you is counseling is going to be paramount. You're going to have to, best you can, get this person some counseling resources. I would suggest calling Calgary 211, calling the Calgary Connect line, and getting advice from them as to the resources that are available to get the person the emotional and psychological support they're going to need. First and foremost, you're going to have to be very empathetic and understanding of what they're going through, and then assisting them and getting them to the resources that the professionals that are going to help them the best. Now, if they're actively suicidal, meaning you fear that they're going to act on it immediately, then obviously you want to call the police, call the Calgary Police Service. We will attend. If we feel that the person is actually suicidal, we can apprehend them under what's called the Mental Health Act, and they can be taken to a hospital to be seen by a doctor. Now, on your own, you can engage a physician. A family physician can get involved, and they can do what's called a Form 1. And this is where a doctor can hospitalize someone who they feel needs to have mental health assistance and support. Now, this is done against the person's will. So the person, even if they don't want to go, if a Form 1 is ordered by a physician, then the person can be apprehended and taken to a secure facility to get them the help they need if you feel like they're in immediate danger of harming themselves. Hopefully that helps answer that.
Thank
And
you.
Pierre might have some answers as well.
Yeah, I'd just like to piggyback on that. I think it goes back to helping each other as well, where you're helping a friend obviously going through a really rough time, but then what's the offender doing? What's happening that way, right? So it's having that conversation with us, with the physician, and so on, and we have so many options, and we have so many resources in Canada that we're so lucky that way, where we can attend. The physician can obviously help with the person that's in distress, and then everybody hopefully gets better, and we figure out a much better solution than just going through that, right? So if that makes sense.
Thank you for those answers. While we're waiting for maybe possible more questions, I also have a question directed for Sergeant Anderson. Some victims are scared to report that they are victims of domestic violence because of possible retaliation from the abuser, especially if the abuser does not get jail time or if they do very little. So how can the police help these victims? What can the police do to stop retaliation?
Well, this is a very, very complex question. It's one I'm glad you asked, because I'm sure a lot of people are thinking this, even though they might not be asking. It's incredibly common. The reality is that even when police attend and even when abusers are arrested, they're likely not going to jail right away. And they're likely, even if they are going to go to jail, they're not going to go to jail for very long. That's the reality of the system that we live in, and good or bad, whether we like it or not, that's the reality. And retaliation is a real thing that happens in domestic abuse cases, and we're very aware of this as police officers. And there's things that we can do to support people once they decide to leave or once they decide to report. So things like having conditions that will be enforced. The emergency protection orders that are put in place, one of the biggest things it does is it gives the residence to the victim, and the abuser isn't allowed to be there. So we try to separate the abuser from the family. That helps often. The reality also is, and we have to live in that realm of, the police aren't going to be there 24 hours a day. And so people have to take ownership over their own safety. The police officers will provide what's called a safety plan. So where it's an actual plan where people can think about, what am I going to do if this happens? What am I going to do if that happens? and they can think about things ahead of time so that if they, in the event that they happen, they're prepared. The things like having an emergency bag available, things like Pierre already talked about, where not going places alone, having someone walk with you to and from work, things like that. Those are safety plans we can put in place. But the biggest thing is that the victim of the abuse has to be willing to participate and to take ownership over their own safety as well. We call it personal safety for a reason, because it's your personal safety, and we have to take responsibility. So being willing to call the police when the abuser shows up at the house, willing to call the police when the abuser calls when they're not supposed to be calling, and so that we can continue to enforce it. What we find is that continued enforcement of the laws is what eventually prevents or helps prevent the violence from continuing. It's a long-winded answer, but I hope that helped.
Yes, thank you very much. And I think we do not have any more questions from our participants. So with that, I would like to thank our resource persons and our audience for your active participation this evening. May I once again invite Consul General Zaldi Patron to deliver the closing remarks.
Yeah, thank you very much, Vice Consul Stephanie. Well, let me also add my appreciation to Sergeant Jeff Anderson and to Constable Pierre Poitras for sharing with us all those very useful information. And to all our participants, I hope that you share the sentiment that this has been a night that is very educational, certainly an eye-opener for me, and I hope it's the same for all of you. And it is very important that we are able to share this information to our community members. The more informed and aware we are, the better for our community, the less incidents that there will be regarding all these public safety problems and domestic violence cases. And I encourage everyone to continue to follow the Philippine Consulate General's Facebook page. We will have more of this in the coming year. We try to be as helpful to our community on issues like this. And for those whom I will not be able to have the chance to greet this season, I would like to extend on behalf of the Philippine Consulate Generals our season's greetings, our Christmas greetings to all of you, and may you always be safe and healthy in your own homes and places of work. Maraming salamat po. Magandang gabi sa inyong lahat.
Thank you very much, Consul General Patron. May I request our speakers and participants to please turn on your cameras so that we can have a virtual group photo. Okay, let's just wait a bit for everyone to turn on their cameras.
I'm just going to hijack your thread there for a sec.
Okay, sure.
For Christmas, everybody, look up a book called The Gift of Fear. I think it'll go a long ways. We try to recommend that for a lot of people. It's pretty much, it talks about that gift of fear that we were given as human beings from a long, long time ago, where sometimes that little voice in the back of your head says, hey, watch out, or you get that spidey sense of there's something wrong here. It's very informational. It's an older book, but it's definitely good still today, and it'll piggyback onto domestic conflict as well.
Thank you for that suggestion. Okay, if everyone's ready, 1, 2, 3, and smile. One more. Okay. 1, 2, 3, smile. Thank you very much. And on behalf of the Philippine Consulate General and Consul General Patron, keep safe and have a good night, everyone. Thank you. Bye-bye.